Look at that. Look at all these smiling faces. Thanks for clapping. Thanks for being here. Love to see all these friendly. Yes, waving is fine. Wave. By the way, have you ever done this thing? It's kind of fun. We're here. I don't know if you can see us in gallery view at the moment, so I can see 49 of us, I guess, at one time. But what you could do is you can give the people next to you a high five. And you just reach up like this to both sides of your screen. You go like this, and you go a high five to everybody else on the call. I mean, that is us. We're being good. Nice. All right. Welcome to Conversations with Modern Stoicism. We got Scott Waltman here with us today. Let's start bringing Scott Waltman up here. Scott, how did we meet?
How did we meet, right? I think we first met on Plato's Academy virtual event for how to think like Socrates, maybe a year and a half ago.
I'm not going to remember the date because
Unless,
it gets worse and worse.
uh,
I just sent a message to
okay.
Donald this morning. I said, "Hey, we're doing our 13th event." And he's like, "Congratulations." I mean, that's kind of cool, right? We managed to
Mhm,
pull that off. But yes, I'm pretty sure it was the Think Like Socrates event,
mhm,
and in which you said something that still tickles me to this day, but I don't need to
okay.
repeat it right here in this
Uh-huh.
moment. But it was
That's-
kind of fun. I'm going to introduce you, but tell people where you are in the world.
I'm currently in the great state of Texas, which is a weird place to be. I'm currently in Texas, and it's already like in the 90s. Like, what is going on here?
You're fighting the good fight in Texas, is what you're telling us. Yeah.
I am. I mean, it's
Trying
hard to leave once you get here, right? It's hard to leave.
There is no day, by the way, that I do not go to Scott's feed that I don't get a
Mm.
laugh out of it. I mean,
Oh,
it's
that's good.
always just, it just brings a tickle for me. All right, I'm going to introduce you. By the way, I have a written introduction here, and I'm going to put some more and better. Thank you, John Matthew. I'm going to put some better links in here in the chat for you from some other things, books that he's worked on, etc. But let me read this introduction so I don't get anything wrong. Scott Waltman is a clinician, international trainer, and practice based researcher with a focus on evidence based psychotherapy practice and training. He is certified as a qualified cognitive therapist and trainer slash consultant by the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies and is board certified in behavioral and cognitive psychology from the American Board of Professional Psychology. Dr. Waltman is known for his work in teaching Socratic questioning skills to therapists and counselors, emphasizing collaborative empiricism or collaborative curiosity as a key concept in therapy. Scott, I've never had so many big words in one person's introduction as
I
that
won.
one. That's a good one. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome Dr. Scott Waltman. Ready? It sounds like this. All right, friend.
Fantastic.
You share slides. I'll slide out of the way and
All right.
I'll just where your thought. Yeah, there you go.
That was such a nice introduction. I always have the intrusive thought of like, I hope I can live up to the person that I am on paper, but we'll see.
Yeah.
So I have some slides. We're going to talk. I have 20 minutes, so I need to talk not too fast and not too slow. Yeah, so as Phil was saying, so my name is Scott. I'm a psychologist. I'm a practicing Stoic. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of my journey with Stoicism, my journey with Socratic method and strategies, but also kind of like, how did we get here? This is one of my favorite quotes from Epictetus, where he says, "And you, although you are not yet a Socrates, should live as someone who wants to be a Socrates." And I think this kind of speaks to the connection between Socrates and Stoicism, because although Socrates lived much earlier than the Stoics, he's often viewed as being the godfather of Stoicism. If I had more time, we could walk through kind of the lineage of how we get from Socrates to Zeno. But there's this idea about who was Socrates, how does this relate to Stoicism, how does this relate to you and me in our everyday lives? So first, how did I get here? Some self-promotion, trying to not do any more than just this slide. So I am a CBT therapist and trainer by trade. I used to be a trainer for Aaron Beck, who was the originator or father of cognitive therapy. And while I was a trainer for him, I was just constantly teaching people. The people I'm teaching are recording their sessions. I'm listening to the recorded sessions. And then I'm finding kind of this theme where people are having a really hard time learning how to do Socratic questioning really well, which is frustrating because it's like a really important part of the skill. It's an important part of kind of therapy in general. So we did some research on the way that people did it, seeing what the common problems were. We found that a lot of therapists fell into the pitfall of trying to convince the client to see it from their point of view, essentially try to convince the client that they're wrong. And as you might know, if you've ever been in a discussion with somebody, if they're trying to show you that you're wrong, generally you tend to lean into why you're right, right? If you have a friend who's in maybe an unhealthy relationship and you keep telling them, you got to leave this guy, you got to leave this guy, you got to leave this guy, they tend to kind of lean into, well, you don't really know, he's actually pretty sweet when you're not around. Right, which is, it's not a very Socratic process. But if you instead lean into, well, help me understand, like, why are you still here? Help me understand how this is working for you. Help me understand. If you can lean in with listening, with that curiosity, then you can have a dialogue. So we had to essentially retool the way we were teaching the Socratic method, which is how we came up with this book, Socratic Questioning for Therapists and Counselors, which is essentially teaching therapists how to approach Socratic questioning, not from the perspective of, let me show you that you are wrong, but let me see it from your point of view. Let me try to understand where you're coming from. And then once I see it once you and I are on the same page, we can try and expand that point of view together. And that book was actually a lot more successful than I thought it was going to be. I don't know. I always just kind of thought like, oh, maybe my mom will buy it and this will be fun. But it's been translated into a number of languages. It's currently in Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese, Russian, Turkish, and there's a Spanish translation in the works as well, which is pretty cool. So then in marketing this, I then reached a lot of people who weren't therapists. They were like, okay, but I would like to learn these strategies for myself. And so we ended up making essentially kind of like the Socratic Questioning for Therapists and Counselors book, like into like a self-practice book or like a self-help kind of book, which is the Stoicism workbook, how the wisdom of Socrates can help you build resilience to overcome anything life throws at you. So it's really kind of a blending of modern CBT through the lens of ancient Stoicism and also lessons we learned from Socrates, which is all connected. So that's how we get here. Here's the link from my Instagram page, which, as Phil already warned you, it's just kind of for my own entertainment at this point. But if you enjoy things that are a little bit silly, you might enjoy that. If you don't enjoy things that are silly, you might try some silly things out because life could benefit from a little silliness sometimes. So let me talk a little bit more about who is Socrates, how do we get to where we're getting to, and what's the point of our conversation for today. So Socrates, this could be like a 6-hour lecture on who is Socrates, and even then I still would not cover kind of all the important things. I do want to note that Donald Robertson has a book coming that's available for pre-order called How to Think Like Socrates, in the style of his How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which is fantastic. I'm someone who was lucky enough to be able to read the advanced version of it. I'm like, yeah, this is my jam. I love this book. So Socrates is probably the most famous philosopher of antiquity, maybe the most famous philosopher ever. He's credited with inventing the ask and answer method of teaching. So instead of just like lecturing and lecturing and lecturing, but teaching through conversation, teaching through listening, teaching through responding to what people are saying. As the story goes, Socrates was living in ancient Athens. His father was a stonemason. His mother was a midwife. He had lived the life of a soldier, though that wasn't unique, right? Because there were some pretty existential wars that happened where the Athenians either had to fight or to kind of lose their identity, and so many people were soldiers at that time. It wasn't the same society we live in now, where there's sort of a small subset of people who are soldiers. But he was a soldier and he served faithfully, so he wasn't just like a pencil pusher kind of guy, even though we have no written record of any of his philosophies that he wrote himself, only through his students. But the story goes is that someone goes to the oracle at Delphi, someone who's supposed to be an all-knowing speaker for the gods, and asks them, who's the wisest? And it comes back, none is wiser than Socrates. So there's this essentially divine pronouncement that no one is wiser than Socrates. And this gets back to Socrates, and he's kind of like confused by it, because on the one hand, he is somebody who believes in the gods, right? He is somebody that believes that that there's a truth to this, and he's trying to live a good life. And at the same time, he knows he's like a fallible person. He's like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, if I'm the wisest that there is, but like I'm actually kind of an idiot sometimes. Like that can't be right. So how do I reconcile the two? And he comes up with this idea. Well, maybe the gods are mistaken. I just got to find someone who's wiser than me, and then I can be kind of freed from this burden of needing to be like the wisest person, and I can just try and live a good life. So he goes about asking people who are supposedly wise about things they know a lot about, trying to find somebody who like is wiser than he. And this turns out to be like a really interesting quest to go on, because he'll approach like a priest and he'll ask them about like piety. He'll approach a general and ask them about courage. He finds people who should know a lot about something, and he starts asking them about these topics. And what he finds is that there's a lot of assumptions being made, and really like everybody is kind of flying blindly in a sense, where there's a lot of ignorance, a lot of not knowing, and essentially everybody is kind of in the dark in a lot of ways. And there's this idea that he settles on, which Plato writes more about, but this idea about double ignorance, where there's things that we don't know, and there's things that we don't know that we don't know. And so his whole thing was trying to help people overcome this ignorance that they had, or he might call it this conceit of wisdom, where people are sure they know something, but they don't really. And so his method was about trying to uncover that ignorance, with the hope that then people could then, try to find true knowledge, try to overcome their ignorance through learning. Though some people were pretty angry when he pointed out to them they didn't know stuff, because they were embarrassed, because they were important people, and how dare you talk to me like that? I'm an important person. But his whole goal was trying to help people overcome the ignorance of not knowing what you don't know. So the perspective of Socrates, it's better to not to if you don't know something, to know you don't know it, than to pretend that you do and potentially make a mistake because of it. There's this teaching method of Socratic irony, which is essentially he would try to bracket off his expectations, and he would try and approach it from like a beginner's mindset, where he wouldn't come in and say like, let me show you why you're wrong. He would say, well, help me understand this. I'm gonna approach this as, and at least initially, from the perspective of not knowing anything about it, so then I can learn from you. Big emphasis on curiosity. The Socratic method, I'm going to talk a little bit about. Of course, Socrates never wrote like a manual, so we don't have like him saying, here's how you do what I do. We have him doing stuff, his students writing it out, sometimes years later, and then us trying to look at what the students wrote to try and like triangulate what was Socrates actually doing. So it's an interesting place to be. In making this book, right, the Stoicism workbook, I had to rethink the way we were teaching the Socratic method. And so I was going through the original dialogues, rereading them, trying to do what modern people would call qualitative analysis. So I was doing like a qualitative research methodology, looking at these ancient dialogues to see like, how is Socrates actually doing this? Is there some kind of rhyme or reason to it? So this is the method that seems to stand out to me with the analysis that I did. So essentially, when Socrates is asking somebody something, say, for example, about courage, right? Initially in the conversation, there's a question of what's the core concept being asked, right? What are we really talking about here? Like, what's the essence of what we're saying? And then once he finds the essence of what we're saying, then he's saying, okay, so what is the operationalization of this concept? What does this mean, right? So we're talking about like courage. What does courage actually mean? And then trying to test that out. So, right, there's this example of he's talking with a general about what does it mean to have courage, and the general says, well, standing your ground no matter what. And then he says, well, is it always courageous to stand your ground no matter what? Because here's an example where standing our ground, we're not standing our ground, actually helped us win the battle. And isn't that interesting? What do you make of that? And then it shifts to, well, maybe courage is being brave, but also like being wise as well. And it kind of shifts to a more inclusive conversation, which is cool. My personal favorite example of understanding the Socratic method is from kind of a silly part in his life, where there's at one point he gets into a beauty contest, which is just something you have to reread a couple times, because you're like, is this right? Did I get like an erroneous version of this when I got this from Barnes and Noble? So Socrates gets into a beauty contest, and Socrates is not famously a beautiful guy, right? I mean, I might say all bodies are good bodies, and everyone's intrinsically beautiful in their own way. The ancient Greeks, they had this idea of an Adonis, right? They had this idea of like, this is what beauty should be. These are what we're going to make statues of. And that wasn't Socrates, right? Socrates was short, and he was stout, perhaps a little fat. He was balding. His nose was upturned. His eyes were bulging. There's a lot of people who talk about him like physically in a way which he probably had a really good personality, but he gets into a beauty contest with this other older guy, kind of like joking around, and so Socrates is being Socrates even here in this moment, right? So they're in this beauty contest. He's trying to figure out, so what's the main thing we're focusing on? We're focusing on beauty. Okay, so what does it mean to be beautiful? And then first, when Socrates is asking them, what does it mean to be beautiful? There's kind of this response of like, well, yeah, we all know what beauty is. Like, why are you even asking that? Like, it's just like aesthetically pleasing. That's fine. So he starts kind of testing the limits a little bit, right? So he says, okay, so can only humans be beautiful? Can other things be beautiful? And they say, well, an animal could be beautiful. And he starts testing it out even further. And there's this point where they say, well, a spear could be beautiful, right? If it was well made for its function, nothing's more beautiful than a good spear. And he's like, functional is beautiful. I can work with that. That's great. So then he starts saying, well, if functional is beautiful, there's a lot of things that people make fun of me for that are actually quite functional. He says, my eyes, they call them crab eyes. His eyes bulged out. And he says, because I have these crab eyes, I can see to the right and I can see to the left a little bit better than my competitors. So aren't my eyes more functional then because of that? My nose is upturned, but because my nose is upturned, I can smell more easily and my nose doesn't block my field of vision. Isn't this more functional? So he starts walking through these like things which might have been liabilities and saying like, hey, this is actually pretty functional. Who's laughing now? Which is, I think, just like a funny and silly way to think about the Socratic method, where he's being a little bit playful, he's being curious, and he's focusing on trying to say, what is the assumption we're making, and does that assumption make sense? Does it have to be that way? Can we expand this and think about this in a more flexible way? Of course, he doesn't win the beauty contest, which is my favorite part of the whole thing, right? So this guy goes through this whole thing, and at the end, they're like, yeah, but like that's not the rules we're playing by. Like you have to be like the beauty that we want you to be, which does kind of highlight sometimes you could be right but still not win, and that's okay, right? Because if you might be in a discussion or a dialogue or a debate with somebody and they might not come to see it the way you see it, that's okay. Even Socrates couldn't convince people to think he was as beautiful as I would think he was. But I'm sure there were some people in the crowd who were like, yeah, Socrates, I can see it now. I can see it now. They kind of moved along. So, keeping an eye on time. So, how do we pull this to like a psychotherapeutic, a coaching, an educational perspective? How do we do this in a different way? So the Socratic method, or in this case, this is the later part of our Stoicism workbook. The last two chapters are devoted to doing a Socratic method on yourself. The first chapter, I guess, is technically the second to last chapter, is focused on like learning like the metacognitive skills, so learning thinking about thinking, learning to understand your assumptions, learning to just identify what are the rules you're following and things like that. And then the next one is moving into what's your self narrative? Where does this come from? What are you missing? How are your behaviors contributing? How do we move forward? So the basic idea about this like self-Socratic method, if somebody was to take this approach, would be to first try and figure out what do we need to go after. This was another thing that came from the research we were doing, where novice therapists can almost become like the thought police, where the client says something that sounds kind of negative and then they jump on it. And then client says something else that sounds kind of negative and they jump on it. And it's kind of like trying to go after everything instead of trying to figure out what you're really going after. I think about like a shark going after like a school of tuna. Like if it tries to go after all of it, it's not going to get it. But if it picks one, it's going to it'll have a full belly. So first, for ourselves, we're trying to figure out, well, what are the fears that are keeping me stuck? What are my self-limiting beliefs? I'm not going to worry about all of my thoughts. Modern cognitive behavioral therapists will say we have probably like 10 to 15,000 thoughts in a day, and so going after all of them would just be probably a waste of time. But what's the story that keeps coming up? All right, where do I find myself getting stuck? What are the assumptions that I have? Do I have self-limiting beliefs? What is the story that I'm telling myself? And then initially trying to lead with like understanding. So where did this come from? In what context did this develop in? When I think this way, what are the things that I do? Does that response create any kind of vicious cycle, right? If I have this idea that because of my history, I think that no one will take me seriously, and I think that if I ask for something, no one's going to give me what I want, then I learned to be passive. I learned to not really ask for things. And then because I don't really ask for things, I have a lot of relationships where I'm not really getting my needs met. And the people that stick around might be the people who kind of like me being a little bit of a doormat. So I might have created a little bit of a vicious cycle. So changing it becomes more than just cognitive, but it becomes behavioral, it becomes experimental, it becomes experiential, really. So how do I first just see the system that I'm in? How do I recognize where's the context that this came from, and how is this being maintained? And if I can see how it's being maintained, then I can see, well, what might I be missing? How can I expand this? Back when I was first learning to be a therapist, my very first supervisor, she's kind of earthy. She would say to me, when we listened to my sessions, she would say, Scott, is this a blind spot or a dumb spot? And I didn't know what she meant at first. I thought she was telling me I was dumb. And so it wasn't really useful for me initially. But then at some point I asked her, like, what do you mean when you say that? And she said, Scott, do you not see this or do you not know this? I was like, wow, okay, that's actually a fantastic question. I wish you would have asked me that. But once we see our system, then we can try and figure out what are we not seeing and what are we not knowing. What we're not knowing is our gaps in experience. Right. If I back to that idea about the person who's not really assertively asking to get their needs met, that person doesn't really know in an experiential way. Like if I try and set a boundary, maybe that can affect the relationship. If I ask for what I want, maybe I can get what I want. Right. It's, for somebody who has a fear of failure, for oftentimes if people have a fear of failure, the risk of failing hurts more than the risk of quitting. And so a lot of times people quit before it gets too hard, or they don't do things that might not happen. And so then if they were to say, well, I have nothing to show for my life because I have no accomplishments, which is a very like sterile one-dimensional way of looking at it. But if we were to walk through this method, we would see, well, it's not so much that you have nothing to show for your life. The evidence doesn't support the idea that you're incompetent. The evidence supports the idea that you're afraid you're incompetent. And actually, you don't really know what you're capable of because you've never really tested yourself. You've never really gone for it. And as Wayne Gretzky says, you miss every shot you don't take. So if you've never really gone for it, we don't really know what you're capable of, which is a very different place than saying I'm an absolute loser. I have nothing to show for my life. And then finally, we want to try and pull it back together. The idea is that balanced thinking is better than purely positive thinking. Purely positive thinking tends to be brittle because life is not purely positive. But trying to find a balanced way of thinking. And then the important question about what are you going to do about this? How are you going to put this into practice? Insight is good, but insight without change in behavior is useless, which is sort of what the main idea of what Stoicism is, okay, it's cool to have this philosophy, but it needs to be a lived philosophy. You have to go, you have to do it. 30 seconds, my last little bit. And this I just kind of tapped on. These slides are going to be made available. This is like a Socratic questioning in a group setting. So some people think about Socratic questioning as just asking questions, but the idea is trying to tie it together to a dialogue. I was running a number of Stoicism groups in the VA. Of course, I don't speak as somebody who has any like authorized way to say like what the government has to say or anything like that. But I was running these groups, and I got some feedback that the way I was running them was better than the way that other folks were running groups. And so I tried to then apply this method about what am I doing that they're not doing. And the basic idea is the same kind of approach. So first, in the conversation, we're trying to figure out what's being said. How can we break it down to its components? Why does this matter? How can this help towards our goals? And then expand on it. What are we missing? Are there other perspectives to take? Are there other experiences to fold in? Are there cultural messages or cultural ideas we can enhance it? Can we put it back together, and then can we create some kind of actionable strategy? So it's a similar idea of really analysis and synthesis. So analysis, let's break it down to its components. Synthesis, let's put it together in a new way. Which I think is kind of what Socrates was doing, was this idea about, okay, let's figure out what are we talking about, let's break it apart, and let's put it back together. Though therapists tend to be more focused on the let's put it back together, Socrates often kind of stopped on the aporia part, but that might have just been that was the more interesting part to write about, and it might just be that we don't have an exact knowledge about what he was doing. But anyways, I think that is my time. So we have some discussion questions set up, right? I gotta stop sharing.
Yeah, let me put me up here with you
Oh,
and do a
hey, we
couple
got
things
feedback.
first.
This is great.
Add spotlight. All right, there we go. Now it's the two of us. Well, first off, we say thank you. I mean, that was awesome. Thank you for
Thanks,
doing
Phil.
that. And
That was kind of you.
well, we try to be that too. But yeah, so I want to start with a question for you before we put the audience into a
Yes.
question. And one of the things I think that you just kind of, I don't know, implied or it was intrinsic for you is that to pull this off, to make this Socratic questioning work,
Mm.
you can't start with the idea that you already know the answer for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to be a little bit open about what that's going to be. And I'm kind of curious about how you reflect upon that. And then I'm going to there's one more piece of this, but
Okay.
the thing is, if I'm just coming in and
Mhm.
whacking you into a spot saying, "No, the sky is cerulean," and that we're going to fight about it until you agree with me, that's not the Socratic method.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point to bring up. And I think it kind of is important on two ends. So one is there's this piece of if I'm approaching this from the perspective that I have nothing to learn, I'm not going to learn anything, right? There's kind of two predictions that will always be right. I'm not going to learn anything from
Right.
being here, and I hope I don't get anxious because if you're afraid of being anxious, you'll always be anxious because fear of fear causes fear. But
All right. You can just, those are
but
two gold nuggets
those
right there, back to back. We could stop and it would be fine. That
we got
was awesome. You're
we
right.
got we got time left. We got time left.
But we
But
got
but
time. So let's keep
but
going.
if you're approaching from the perspective of nothing to learn, you're not going to learn anything. But if you're in a dialogue and you're approaching the dialogue from I have nothing to learn, you have something to learn, people will mirror how you approach it. So if I approach this from a place of arrogance, it's going to pull for arrogance. If I approach from a place of a refusal to listen, the other person's not going to listen. Then it's an argument, not a dialogue. So I think, being open helps kind of foster openness, but as a practitioner, it's even more important because my assumptions aren't always right, right? Like somebody can come in and I can think, here's what I think the right answer is. I just need to get them to get there. But then once I listen to them, once I understand the context of their life, once we be curious and we explore, there's gems we find I never would have known about. So
Yeah.
it's really
We always say in our groups,
mm,
we talk about replacing judgment with curiosity.
yeah.
Just saying, take a moment and kind
Mm,
of lean back and figure it. And so this kind of leads me to the second part of this is curiosity requires space.
yeah.
And you have to leave room for people to think and develop these answers and responses. Because if you're in a hurry, you can bulldoze right past the truth, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And it's easy to kind of create this like echo chamber idea of like, here's what the truth is. Somebody comes in, let me give you kind of the package of like what you should be thinking, problem solve, kind of assembly line, move on. But it's harder to slow down and bake from scratch, right? It's harder to slow down and really, really listen, really pay attention, really be curious. You have to do it in order to recognize that it's better, right? You have to do it in order to go like, okay, that was actually pretty amazing, and I love my life, and this I'm so lucky that I get to do this. It's
Yeah,
it's a
I
beautiful
think
thing, and you have to really see the beauty of it. It's like comparing, in my mind, like true art versus like AI art, right? Like AI art is like impressive at times, but like it's not soulful in the same way, right? As somebody's like really connected with it, where it means something.
okay, I can't let you do that because there's going to be another 2 hours. We're having
Is
to end
there?
the call. If we're going to
Is
expand this, we're going to talk for another couple hours
oh
on
God.
AI and questioning and all the rest of that. So I think
Okay.
that's good.
I
Um,
apologize.
no, no, no.
I'm just
I
you
think
said
it's
Donald came twice,
fantastic.
and I was trying to come back. That's what happened. I was
No,
like,
you're coming back. There's no doubt about that. Okay. How do we overcome our own ignorance? How do we
yeah.
overcome our own personal blind spots? And listen, when we asked you that question, we were looking for ideas. It's not that we had the answers. We're trying to figure out how you do this. So let's take a couple of shares here. But put your hand up. So I'm just going to add Rick up to the spotlight. And then I'm going to ask Rick to unmute. And Rick, tell us about how you do this.
We need other people.
Yeah.
They could be people we know, or they could be people we don't know. Inevitably, other people are going to have different expectations and perspectives. And if we care about our ignorance, we'll inevitably find it by being in relationship, any kind of relationship with any other kind of person.
I like that. What do you think, Scott?
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Right. If there's something I can't see, the best way to see it is be with somebody else who can see what I can't see. And either like gently or like I had this moment where I go like, oh no, I didn't realize that I didn't know these things. But yeah, I think social interactions, traveling, being different places, living different places, certainly. Yeah,
Yeah,
I love it.
I like that. Let me just go ahead and get this in. Rick brings up the fact of needing other people.
Mhm.
And, we don't know what we don't know, but the way to find out what you don't know is to get married, and your wife will tell you. So you can just add this. And I mean this in the nicest way possible. I'm a
Uh,
very lucky man, full of persistence,
that's funny. Isn't
and
that
all the rest.
there's that Socrates quote about like getting married, but it turns out like it's not a true Socrates quote, right? That like get married, like
Right.
maybe you'll be happy. If you're not happy, you'll be a philosopher. But I think that was debunked and like not a true Socrates quote though, right? Is anybody like a true like quote head?
It's
All right.
it's probably somebody who like referenced, because of Xanthippe was known to be such a shrew, right? And
Yeah.
it is probably what that was all
But
about.
but
So
was
I
she,
mean
or,
this in
or
the
or was he just always gone talking to people? And she's like, "Hey, why aren't you ever home with me?" Right? Like, was she that way, or did he make her that way?
look at this. Like Scott Waltman says, there's good money to be made doing some couples counseling with those folks. I'm just saying.
Oh
All
yeah,
right.
interest
Ma-
accrued. That'd be fantastic. Sorry, I apologize.
it's okay. Massimiliano, can I get you to unmute? Oh yeah, I
Yes.
got you.
Well,
There you go.
have that.
Tell
Well, Nick
us.
took the words out of my mouth. That's what
Okay.
I was more or less about to say. Is that the best way to find out what our blind spots are is to confront ourselves with others. I might be able to add one thing to that. It
Mhm.
requires a lot of courage to do so, and you have to be willing to make yourself vulnerable because, especially when you're talking to people you don't know, which is usually the best kind of feedback you can get, is when you
Mhm.
don't know the person or they're from a totally different culture from yours. So yeah, those are the two things I would add: courage and vulnerability.
Yeah, I love that. So it's being around other people, but not just blindly being around people, but there's like an intentionality you have to have, where you have to instead of viewing this as like, oh, everybody else is so weird, you have to have the recognition that like I'm part of everyone. And so like if they seem weird to me, I might seem weird to them. If they have strange views, maybe I have strange views. And then it sounds like also some like curiosity or some vulnerability where it's not about who's right or wrong. I don't need to defend myself. This is,
Exactly.
as Phil said earlier, it's a learning opportunity.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
like
I love
that.
that.
Thank you, Massimiliano. I'm gonna tell you something too that Massimiliano kind of puts in my head here as we're
Mhm.
thinking about this, is that and you both did. It takes a certain bit of courage to go reach out to those folks and add them to whatever circle that you're going to use in which you're going to get that data. And you might have to be very clear in your own thinking. Like, I will tell you my problem, right? I'm just going to paint you with a fill brush in this. Some of my problems, like I run, in my professional life, I run events for technology people, and I'm always concerned that because I'm an old guy, that I'm not got young people's thoughts about where they are in their careers and what they're doing. So I deliberately bring people in that would not normally show up in my circles and say, well, what do you think about this? How does this work? What are the things you're actually facing? But if I weren't intentional in finding people of diverse age. I conquered the gender one a long time ago. We invite lots of women to the events because I want to know what they're working on in their lives. But, and we do these in various cities. I also have a racial diversity thing that I'm trying to get done only because I'm trying to understand what's going on. And I'm thinking what I don't know that I don't know is what's going to hurt me in the end.
Yeah.
Keith is here. Keith, talk to us about how we can, I don't know, I don't want to say not be so stupid, but how can we be not so ignorant?
Well, I think the whole conversation reminds me of a book written a long time ago by Shunryu Suzuki, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. That whole Zen teaching of maintaining a beginner's mind, just
Mhm.
always being open and curious and never assume you're an expert.
Yeah. That's a fantastic point, right? So the best way to kind of to not get locked up in the stories we tell ourselves and the ways and doing what we always do and seeing what we always see is trying to approach it from that beginner's mindset, trying to see things anew. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's cool.
Gold nugget. What would an alien see, right? Someone
Mhm.
come from another planet. How would they see
Yeah.
this?
Well, and I think something else to add to what Keith is saying is what he's saying is like this is a practice, right? You can't just say like I want to take like a beginner's mindset. But you have to cultivate the ability to do that. It's beautiful.
Right. I agree. All right, I'm gonna take one more, Steve Powell, and I see the rest of
Oh,
those hands, and I'm sorry,
I
but
want all of them. This is okay.
we're gonna get you afterwards. Don't
I
forget,
know.
there's bonus time at the end of
Okay.
this thing, but I'm gonna keep you on track for the moment. But we want to
Okay.
get all your questions. Let's start with Steve here.
Hi guys, thanks Phil. So we talked about self-awareness. We were hitting some similar topics to the other folks that I've talked to already, but we weren't kind of using other people. We were using ourselves, a bit of kind of distance between particular events, and using journaling to cross-examine ourselves, or cross-examining is probably too harsh, but kind of reflecting and refining and coming at it from a more open mindset, a more generous interpretation. So we were using the same kind of ideas, but kind of using ourselves and that kind of self-reflexivity, self-reflection more.
That's like level one, right? That's how way we get started, Scott.
Yeah, I think reflection kind of like fits in all the pieces. If you think about like, so if I was to nerd out with psychology for a little bit, so if anybody like really is obsessed with these kind of things, you could Google Kolb's model of experiential learning, which has to focus on like how do we learn in an experiential way, and that like reflective processing, kind of like at the start and at the beginning, is often how we think like learning gets consolidated. So certainly it's an important part of not just behaving in an automatic like mode, just doing what I always do, but trying to sit back and be like, how did that actually go? What did I actually say? Like if I just gave so many talks on Socratic questioning where I didn't have to think about it, I just kind of said it, like hopefully it's good because that's the way I'm always going to do it. But if afterwards, if I stop and reflect and say, okay, how did that actually go? What did I actually do? Like what went well, what didn't go well? Then I can start refining, then I can start improving. And it's not just copy paste, but it's hopefully evolution.
Yeah, no, I love it. Thank you, Steve. And again, the rest will come back afterwards. Let's get you into that second breakout room. And then don't forget there's some bonus opportunity for questions after that.
Okay, so second question. This is the question that is in my heart the most. So, as Socratic questioning, there's kind of two ways of thinking about it, right? So, sometimes people think about, and usually people will ask me this question as a trainer. They'll say, Scott, how do I ask people questions to get them to the right conclusions? And I'm always like, ah, right? So, the question is from the perspective of like a teacher, an educator, a coach, even like your own self-practice, is it better to try to breadcrumb somebody to like what we think the right answer is, or is it better to kind of follow along with like a joint discovery to somewhere unknown, which may or may not be what we think it's going to be? So is it better to try to lead somebody or to explore side by side with them?
Yeah. Does aporia part of this? You thinking either, I mean, for the other person, trying to pointing to that spot, or for both of us?
Mm-hmm.
Am I trying to drive into either one of us or both of us to a state of
Yeah.
uncertainty?
I think that initially there has to be some kind of aporia, but then the question is like, what do you do go from there, right? Because I think somebody might say aporia, and then okay, let me give you my cards. This is right. Like, let me make you doubt your perspective and tell you my perspective, which I think is one way. And then somebody else might say, here's aporia, but then like, okay, what do we not know? And let's piece it together. Let's you and I both be the what was the Scooby-Doo team with like all the why
The
am I
mystery
forgetting them?
machine?
The mystery
Yeah.
machine. So we'll be the mystery machine together and we'll kind of figure this out.
Yeah. All right. I gotcha. Okay. So the question is, we've got it inside the chat. Socratic practitioners, is it better to try to guide someone to a predetermined conclusion, as Scott said, breadcrumb them, or follow the dialogue to an unknown destination? You know, we are fellow travelers, hopefully headed towards the truth, and we'll figure it out as we go along. Which of those is better and how, why? So I'd love to get a little bit of feedback. I see Keith's got his hand up already. I think that's new, but give a talk about how, what is it? Do you go, are you headed someplace in particular, or do you kind of just like, are you along for the journey? So we're going to start. We got Keith and user Z, but I know that's not your name because we've had this conversation before. But let me pull this here. We'll take a couple of these here, and then we'll do our end of show kind of stuff. But first off, I'm going to add Keith back into the spotlight and ask Keith to unmute. Here you go.
This was a good question. I like this question because I think it's all context. Because I'm a physician, okay, and I have been on the receiving end and the giving end many times of that physician dialogue with residents and interns, where you're rounding on patients in the hospital and you're the attending with your group of minions, your interns and residents, and you're having a dialogue that's somewhat like a Socratic dialogue. But there is a right and a wrong answer.
Yeah.
So you do have to lead them along with breadcrumbs to get them to the right answer, because that's important. You don't want to affect the patient's health. And so you ask them questions back and forth that's guiding them to the place you want them to be. And so that you can see their train of thought. What would you order next? Okay, well, what if that lab came back this? What would you do next? So in that case, it strikes me as it's somewhat like the Socratic method, and yet you are definitely leading breadcrumbs, and there is a right and a wrong answer. So I just wanted to point out that in my unique context, it was kind of a very interesting question.
It is. I like that.
Yeah.
And it highlights that it can be kind of life and death in some ways too, which it sounds like there's kind of core ideas here. So one is like, if there is a true right answer, I mean, it sounds like you're trying to breadcrumb them too, but there is a piece of it you're kind of hoping that they'll get there on their own
I want
first.
them to arrive on their own to show that they're developing the right processes.
Yeah. There's this developmental psychologist, Vygotsky, who had kind of this idea about like scaffolding, where essentially like the more knowledgeable other or kind of the person in the mentor role, our job is to kind of provide scaffolding where people can build on, and we're trying to use only as much scaffolding as they need to try to get them there. But certainly I can see how you're saying, like, I don't necessarily want to take this wherever it goes, in that we have to be kind of efficient for time, and there is a true right answer. So that's a fantastic point.
On the other hand, if
Yeah,
I'm counseling a patient about a diet or a medication or an exercise program, it's not going to be a Socratic dialogue because I'm educating them and I want them to know the right answer. So
Right.
again, context.
Yeah, that's true. You can't ask questions about things that people don't know things about. You couldn't ask them like, what's the deal with like these peptides or something, and they wouldn't know what's going on with it. You have to tell them like, here's what I know. Here's what you got. Yeah, this is cool. All right, I'm excited
That's
to
good.
put this
I
all
like it.
together.
Yeah, me too. But I'm familiar with Gladys Knight and the peptides, but maybe a lot of people aren't. So maybe that's not it. All right. Chris, I think it is, right? Is that your name? Tell me your name when you unmute yourself.
Call me
Hello.
Atish.
Welcome. What's the question you have for Scott or your observation on this particular issue?
Well, after the conversation I have with all of them, so the conclusion is basically it is context dependent. Like, yeah, because there are a lot of factors. Like, for example, if you're in a workplace and you have a deadline coming up, you don't have time to, lead people to an unknown destination because that will mess things up. So, if you are, if it's urgent, you don't have much time, so you need to try a different approach, like guiding them to a predetermined conclusion. But I think still you kind of have a cooperative approach about it. Like, for example, I had some teachers, even though like they were smarter than me, they were more friendly, like, they were just like a friend that were just sit with me and they asked me a lot of thought-provoking questions, and they let me reach the conclusion by myself. Like I had to think, like they asked such open-ended questions that I had to think a lot about this, and I myself reached the conclusion. So when you're yourself are reaching a conclusion, you are more receptive. When you feel like someone is forcing you to reach a conclusion, like, kind of acting superior in some way, and so you are not that receptive, I think. So yeah.
Ooh. Yeah, I love that.
Thank you.
And I think you're saying a lot, but the thing I want to highlight, you're saying even if there is like a predetermined place you're trying to get to, like there still is space for curiosity, for collaboration, for civility and kindness. Yeah.
That is exactly what we want to have happen, right? I mean, I think that's what we want to happen. That was a goal of mine, is to how do we have a civil conversation no matter where we're headed. So I don't know what the answer to this thing is going to be, but let's figure that out. All right, I know I've got some hands up. Let me tell you where we are in this. So we're at the bottom of the clock. So I'm going to do a couple of things that kind of get us out of here. And for those of you who said, look, I feel I've got an hour and a half and I got to go, then you can go and that's fine. You can walk out the door. But for those of you who would like to stand around and hang with our bonus Q&A with Scott, please do that. First off, I stuck all of his links back down inside the chat in case that's your thing. So if you want to know more about Scott, do that. I'm going to say, I think it's time that we all said thank you to Scott Waltman, right? So how we do that is I give you the amazing and awesome power to unmute, and I'm going to count you down, and we're all going to say thank you at the same time. We're going to do it together. Ready? All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1, go.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Scott.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott.
Awesome. Thank you.
That was beautiful.
Brilliant.
Wow.
Thanks to you,
Thank
Phil, too.
you very
This
much.
never. Thank you. It never gets old, does it, to hear all
And
these
thank you.
lovely voices?
And thank you.
And I popped it back. So welcome and thank you all for doing your thing, doing that here. Okay. Thank you for being here. And now we're going into bonus time. And in bonus time, we take questions from the audience on the topic. You got questions for Scott about asking good questions or some observations about some of the processes. You can put your hands back up and I will take you in some order over that. So here's my question. Do you have questions? Do you wonder about this? How does this feel in doing this kind of thing, right? I mean, I am famous among my cohort of friends for never answering a question, always asking one back. Right. And it's like, I'm just going to keep leading this in. And the thing is, they realize that for them, this is how they get to the next level. Because if I answered the question, they would want to. And by the way, I learned part of this by having teenagers. You tell them what you want them to think that this doesn't work. You have to ask them a question and see if they'll come to the idea on their own. We're going to take questions from the audience. And by the way, yeah, I know that's how Socrates got himself killed. But remember, it's what he was trying to get done, almost.
And he was also kind of besmirched by the play a little bit, right? The trouble was that it was a tainted jury. That was the problem. But anyways.
Absolutely. Okay. So I got Rogine up here. I'm going to ask her to unmute. And let's start with her. And by the way, as a flip, if you don't come up with the right question, Scott's going to ask you a question instead. So
yeah, we said bi-directional Q&A. Isn't that fun?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you mentioned teenagers. I'm falling into the trap of thinking, okay, niece, you have to communicate in a way I can understand. It's like, I don't know what you meant. I'm really fair. If someone won't answer your question, well, if you don't understand someone's answer, like, what does that emoji mean? It's hard not to try to drive to a conclusion about, you have to speak English to me.
All right. Do we get to lay that on the other person? If we don't understand them, we just tell them we don't understand them. Or is there some other way around this, Scott?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic scenario to bring up, kind of highlighting like perhaps intergenerational differences. I think a good Stoic is going to be really strategic and focus on, because I think there's the question about like, how do we go about dealing with it? But I think especially with teenagers, a lot of it comes down to like, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And like, essentially a lot of it comes back to like, that thing where you awkwardly have to like recreate a relationship with somebody you already had a relationship with, and all of a sudden you have to like do it again, and like you shouldn't have to, but like it's just the way that it is. It's a weird time, right? Because I think for teenagers are fantastically good at not knowing what any of their blind spots are, and are fantastically good at like having like a dangerous amount of like a self-assurance, and are really, really bad at like taking the feedback of like, the world isn't the way you think it is. Slow down. Your brain is more of a gland than an organ right now. Like you need to like not do anything that's going to ruin your life. It's really hard to convey that, because we're all of a sudden like, you hit an age where the movie Footloose, you're John Lithgow, not Kevin Bacon, and you're like, how did this happen? I always thought I was Kevin Bacon, but all of a sudden I'm John Lithgow. Like, what's going on? I don't know how that happened in my life. So I think a lot of it has to. So is if you hit an impasse, right, where you feel like you're not having the communication you want to have, then it comes back to the foundation, which is the relationship. Which is, from Stoicism, we might think about like cosmopolitanism. Somebody put in the chat the Zeno quote about like, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should listen twice as much as we speak, which is fantastic as well. But I wish there was a nice, easy way to get kids talking. The truism, which maybe isn't always true, but the truism for kids is, if the hands are moving, the mouth is moving. So sometimes you can kind of distract people from their defensiveness by engaging in some kind of like task together. So let's do this puzzle together. Let's play a game together. Same thing with men, right? So men will never talk to each other about our emotions, but like, we're on a fishing trip and all of a sudden I'm telling you that like, I think my dad didn't love me, and I don't know what happens when we die, and all these things that I would never tell anyone. But it's because it's not head on, but it's just kind of side by side discourse while we're doing something else. So fold in an activity, focus on the relationship, focus on demonstrating that you care.
That is yet another fantastic insight from Scott Waltman. I mean, I'm just telling you, this thing is full of nuggets. It's really useful, right? That whole idea. And I know the thing is, I've used that very technique in other places where you distract people from the conversation by giving them something to do, like cooking a dish or something like that, right? And you give them a shared exercise. And the thing is, they don't realize that what you're really trying to get them to do is talk to each other. But we get it by wrapping it around some activity that confuses their brain, distracts them in that bit. All right, Neil is up. Hey, Neil, lean into this thing for me, Kat. I mean, you're so comfortable back there. I was afraid
that weather's
so
pretty. Is that a white pine, white long needle pine? What kind of tree is that behind you?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, it's just it is a pine tree. Correct.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, sunny England. So thank you, Scott. It's a question for you, really. I love asking questions. I've always been curious from a kid. And I think one of the challenges I have is almost trying to think ahead to my next few questions and not be fully engaged in the conversation. And I think part of that's almost tied into a little bit of ego about asking the right question or the killer question. And I just wondered if you had any tips. Of course, it's about really, truly listening. But how do you get away from thinking about, is this a good question and what's my next question, to actually really engage in that conversation was what I was going to get from you.
Oh, I love this. You're speaking to my heart right now, right? The question is like, are we kind of like, do we have a big question and we're breaking this big question down to its components and we're walking through the process of getting there? Or are we organically taking it as we move along? And I think kind of the question, the idea that came up from the second round of the breakout rooms was it depends on context. I think it depends on how somebody's responding, right? If you have like a flow of questions and it's proceeding well, that's great. If you have a flow of questions that's not proceeding well and you're trying to force it, then it's probably a weird conversation. The other person's probably a little uncomfortable. What I will say is just as a little bit of just not for you necessarily, Neil, but just kind of everybody in general, a little piece of CBT knowledge. When we move into the realm of like social anxiety, sometimes people with social anxiety have a fear they're going to say something wrong, and so they have a safety behavior or a false safety behavior where they do something that they don't have to do, or they'll prepare what they're going to say before they say it because they're afraid that it's going to come across weird. And what happens is, if you're in a conversation with somebody and you're afraid you're going to say something weird, so you're preparing what you're going to say before you say it, you're not listening to what the other person's saying because you're preparing what you're going to say. And then when you finally say it, they look at you like, what are you talking about? Because what you say didn't line up with the conversation. It lines up with where you were like 5 minutes ago. And then so a lot of times social anxiety then start over preparing. They try and do more and more of the safety behavior. And what we found is that if you can get people to get lost in the conversation instead of getting lost in their heads, that solves a lot of the problems that they're having. So that's not what you were asking about, but I just feel like a nice place to fold in like a nice useful nugget. But pragmatically, I think I enjoy the conversation more just intrinsically if I just kind of follow it as it goes. I think if I have somebody that I'm teaching and I want them to arrive at a very specific conclusion for very important reasons, then I think it's helpful. But if this is somebody I'm talking to informally, just for like my own enjoyment, I'd rather take the scenic route. I'd rather kind of wander a little bit because people surprise me, and that's like my favorite thing in life is all of a sudden like I didn't know I was going to find this, and this is so cool and interesting. So I'm always just kind of looking for these moments there.
I love that analogy, taking the scenic road. That's a really powerful metaphor. I love that.
Oh, thanks, no.
Yeah. I think the secret to certain conversations, right, is to simply not be in a hurry. Mm-hmm. It's just like be willing to be open in that spot and be able to pay a little bit of attention and kind of make that thing happen that way. Yeah. So I like that.
And the conversation will be interesting if you try to find it interesting, right? The conversation will be like terrible if you treat it as like, I can't wait till this is over.
You think you're the only person that knows that, right? You're the only one that's like, I got that figured out. Like I'm the only one who knows that this is an uninteresting conversation. You can't tell that I'm bored by you.
I've been in a conversation with somebody who's bored by it. Isn't that like the worst feeling? You're like, oh man.
Well, here's the thing. Can I into your spot about this, by the way? And it leads me to a thing I want to ask before we get into Courtney's question here. But yeah, I've been in conversations where like I was talking to somebody and they were completely immune to my conversational skills. I couldn't engage them. I couldn't find a hook. And I am so unused to that I was just thrown off. I'm like, oh my God, this doesn't work. How can this not work? It always works. And, I've just got lost in my own thing. There is go ahead.
I was going to say similarly, maybe a little different, but oftentimes I do a lot of telehealth and periodically like my dog will walk in the room. I'm like, hey, do you want to see my dog? One time I had a patient be like, no, I don't want to see your dog. And it was so bizarre to me. I was like, everybody wants to see my dog. What are you talking about? But it was just a good moment for me to be like, okay, I guess that's not the reason why we're meeting. Let's move forward. But that's funny.
Yeah, it's not. Hey, there is a thread, by the way, now in people talking about conversations, communications, the idea of deep questions, right? How do I get to something that gives me emotional engagement and a chance to kind of get a little more closely meshed to someone. I think that kind of folds in with where you were there a second ago. What's your own feeling about that? How does that play into your questioning style on CBT? And then we'll go to Courtney.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic. And there's people who make lists of like, here's some deep questions to have to have a really good conversation. I
Right.
think it can create like a forced intimacy that can be really uncomfortable. I think if you meet somebody and they ask you like, I'm like, hey, I'm Scott, nice to meet you, like pass the dip, and they're like, Scott, what do you think happens when we die? I would be like, I don't even know, man. I can't even. Just give me. I just got here. I don't know yet. Like, give me a second. I think. I mean, there's beautiful like deep questions to really get into, but I think it's similar. This is maybe not a good analogy, but it's similar to like sex in that you can't skip the foreplay, right? Like if you want to have a good deep conversation, you have to treat the simple things as deep, right? You have to really be present and show somebody that you're somebody who's safe and engaging to have a deep conversation with. So you have
Yeah.
to preheat the oven together. You can't just jump there.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. There's got to be those come closer moments before we get to getting something really tight and
You
entangled.
definitely did that on purpose, Phil. You definitely did that on purpose.
Yeah.
That's funny.
All right. Where's Courtney? What's your question?
Well, it's a very interesting topic, so thank you, Scott.
Oh,
I practice psychotherapy too, and I'm quite interested in Stoicism, and I read Plato's Socrates as well. So I'm curious about, I think my approach to thinking about this has taken on a very traditional form as a kind of critique almost, or alternative to modern CBT, for example. So I'm quite interested in how you would integrate, like you've talked about what Socrates might have as his elenchus. What about the protreptic elements? And from the Stoic point of view, maybe some of the dogmatic elements, like the philosophical principles that you would draw on that you see as relevant for a project towards flourishing or well-being, for example?
Yeah, these are fantastic questions. And I think oftentimes as philosophers, we try to, or philosopher or therapists, I think we there's the elenchus, but I think we usually try to shift towards like the maieutic method, that kind of more midwife approach, because the goal isn't just to show my client that like they're being like inconsistent and irrational, therefore they go to like therapy jail and I win. But I think the goal is to help people walk through the process. I mean something like these, there's a few parts of your question, but I think two things I want to focus on. These might not be what you were wanting me to focus on, but these are two I might focus on. So one, I think, modern CBT is based on ancient Stoicism, and modern CBT, the idea is that like your thoughts affect what you feel and what you do. But my read of the ancient Stoics, especially when you get to like Chrysippus, is he's not saying like your thoughts affect it. He's saying your judgments affect it. And therefore the goal is to move away from your judgments and learn to be non-judgmental as a way to not have these unnecessary emotional responses. So then you can focus on flourishing. And I think that really makes a difference, because there's places where like CBT gets really cheapened, right? There's ways that we teach CBT where we'll have some arbitrary situation to show there's different ways of thinking about it, therefore change your thinking, therefore problem solved, which is highly reductionistic. And so there might be an example, like imagine you're driving in traffic and someone cuts you off and you're mad about it. But what if this person's taken their wife to the hospital? All of a sudden, like maybe you're not mad about it. But I don't think the Stoics would take that route. I think the Stoics would say like, okay, somebody cuts you off, like, why does that matter to you? Like, how are you going to let that ruin your day? Like, maybe they cut you off because they were being a jerk. Maybe they did it on purpose. So what? Like, you don't have control over it. How much do you want to spend time focusing on it? And I think that's where like Ellis and Beck differentiate, right? 'Cause I think Beck is more focused on, is this thought true? And Ellis is more focused on like, okay, what is the demand you have of the universe? Right? Where is the rigidity you have, and can you let go of that? If you can let go of your demands, if you can focus on just trying to live a life guided by what you care about, then there's space for flourishing, which I think is probably why REBT lines up a little bit better with Stoicism than like a Beckian CBT. But I feel like I didn't answer your question though. What's the piece of the question I'm missing?
No, I mean, that's okay. I think it's a big question. I guess you're right. It's like, I think the Stoics are trying to cultivate a worldview, with its complex physics and ethics and the like. And so if you did hold the views that the Stoics are talking about, then yeah, you wouldn't be asking, what's an alternative view that I could put in place here? It's just the belief fills in, like, well, I can't be hurt. I live in a cosmos that means me well, so why would I worry about a car cutting me off? But I guess another question then, like on the same train, if your hobby was to create like a psychotherapy that was a bit more consistently ancient, for example, if that was possible even, then it would be more non-Cartesian, for example. So looking at, say, the new kind of sciences of embodied cognition, for example, and phenomenology, things like that. How would you build that? I think you could build that into a Stoic practice, a Stoic psychotherapy.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Similar to like acceptance and commitment therapy, the goal of Stoicism is living a good life, living well. Right. There's some attention to like, what's the story I tell myself, and am I having unnecessary suffering, and hopefully some idea about letting go of that suffering. But the exact thoughts I'm having don't matter as much as what I do. Or talk is cheap, but what I'm actually doing and what helps me live that way, I think makes a lot of sense. I think that currently there is a real emphasis on like somatic therapies and body focused stuff, which I think psychotherapeutically we don't really understand as well as like we need to really understand how to use it. But I think if you look at like Rufus and Cato and their ideas of like kind of training the body, training the mind and body are connected, strong, deliberately exposing yourself to hardship, it creates an opportunity for growth, right? I think that's the place where the Stoics really focus on. It's not just that stress equals strength, but stress equals opportunity. And if you can approach it from the right perspective, I guess from a growth mindset or from a willingness, from a curiosity, as a challenge, then you can grow from it.
Yeah, and especially last point, I guess, that we were made to be in cooperation with one another. So that as Foucault says, to care for another is the act of caring for oneself, that kind of idea.
Yeah, I love that. Right? What's bad for the hive is bad for the bee in a sense, but it's cool.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that.
Oh, Courtney, this was nice.
Thank you, Courtney. That was great. Appreciate you doing that. All right. Marcel, I think, is next. I'm going to add Marcel up here with us and ask Marcel to unmute. And Marcel, how about sharing your question for Scott?
Yes, I've kind of got a question for both of you because I've noticed that I like to question things, right? I like to use the Socratic method. And I've noticed that people don't like their assumptions to be questioned. So you kind of tend to drive people away if you ask them too much about what they believe. And I was wondering how you both deal with that, like still ask those questions, but not push people away from you.
Yeah, fantastic questions. The idea about like, we have the Socratic method, we have these strategies, we're really curious about what people think. And then as you start digging, sometimes people don't love the fact that you're digging, which of course is like true Socratic method, because a lot of people Socrates was asking were like, leave us alone, Socrates, like don't ask us all these questions. Although a lot of the people he asked were like, wow, this is beautiful, I didn't know that I didn't know these things, and that maybe I can grow from this. But so how do we approach this? So I approach this from the perspective of like permission asking and focusing on being like curious and trying to understand things better. Like if I'm going to ask somebody a question about something, I usually don't just dig in and ask them the question, but I'll say, hey, can we have a conversation about this? Would you be okay? Can we look at this together? I'm curious about this. Can we talk about it? Because if somebody's really unwilling and they say no, then I know not to go there, because it's not going to, you can't have like a one-sided Socratic dialogue, right? It's a dialect where both people are asking and answering questions. Which I guess maybe in a Stoic way is knowing like dichotomy of control. I can't control them, but pragmatically, it comes back to similar to what we were talking about earlier with, is it Rojan? The question about like the nieces, about like how do I demonstrate that I really care? How do I approach this from a place of pure curiosity? Because if I'm talking with somebody about something really sensitive, if it seems like I'm too sterile, if it seems like I'm trying to approach it as like this like esteemed intellectual instead of this like I'm curious, I'm here with you, a collaborative kind of process. If you're truly curious and you genuinely want to know, people usually will talk with you about things. But I can't force it. One more point. I know we're low on time. One more point is like, I think timing is useful, right? Because maybe you want to have a conversation with somebody, you can have a conversation about having a conversation, and then you don't have to, it doesn't have to be now. Like at some point, would you open this? I'd be curious to learn more about this. And because I think sometimes like we're eager to have that conversation and other folks are maybe open to it, but like it's just maybe bad timing for them. Ugh, speaking of which, you guys want to see my puppy?
Look at that.
Everybody wants to see your dog, right?
I know, right? Everybody, I know. She was just spayed, and so she's wearing this like a onesie to protect her from chewing on her little spot. But
she's really cute.
This is what my cats do to my microphones. They just come by and try to knock over the cameras and the microphones.
I know,
and everything
right?
else. Yeah.
But thanks for the point, though, Scott.
Yeah.
I've never thought about, asking consent for a conversation, but it makes a lot of sense. It was like a blind spot for me.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool. I'm glad.
Oh, nice. Look at that. Just a callback for us. I like that, Marcel. You're playing the game with us. So
I do.
I mean,
he's the plant. We got this.
Yeah, I know. In a professional setting, Marcel, a thing that I might do before I lead someone into a path is, like you may come into a conversation and everybody knows what the purpose of it was, right? If you're in an HR conversation with an employee and you're asking questions, everyone knows you're headed somewhere with this thing. So you've got intent wrapped around that. But sometimes when the intent isn't really clear, I'll simply look at someone and say, can I ask some questions about that? I'm kind of curious about where you're headed with it. And they give consent. And then you kind of move forward. And as Scott points out, they could be in a bad spot. For one reason or another, they might say no. And I'll just go, yeah, okay. That's cool. I mean, that's it. That's fine. But, in our mastermind sessions, for example, it comes to the point where I will look at someone and go, and this is the strongest this ever gets, Marcel. But someone will tell a tale, and I will look at them in this place where we already have established positive regard and safety and all this stuff. And I'll say, can I just gently call on that? It's like, I don't think that's what you really think.
That's funny.
Help me figure that out. But I think that's that bit. So Marcel, thank you for this. And let me ask Scott, come back to this, where Scott, one piece of this. And here's what I'm wondering about. So we talk about all of these things in all the ways that we ask questions and things like that. This requires a fair amount of practice, and I would say EQ at some layer. That if we can't read our own emotions and read the emotions of the person we're with, and we can't respond appropriately, this is way harder than we're making it sound.
Yeah.
How do you teach for that?
I think a lot of it comes down to curiosity, right? If you can have curiosity with yourself and curiosity with others, a lot flows. When people are new to learning like a Socratic method, usually they say like, okay, what are the good questions I should ask? And it's hard because like, yes, people do need to learn questions, but more than questions, they need to learn like how to think, right? They need to learn to try to have this like curious mindset where you're just trying to understand. Because if you're trying to understand, the best questions usually come pretty naturally. So, which comes back to that idea that.
And it creates that spot, right, where the other person is more willing to be an interlocutor with you. Because if you come at a point, like you said, if you're coming at this with a judgment, if you're coming at this because you're trying to midwife a particular idea, then people sense that right away. Whereas if I can come back with a little bit of curiosity and say, I don't know, I'm just exploring this with you. I am, as I tell this audience here, I'm a fellow traveler. I am not coming at this as a sage. I am a fellow traveler. I'm trying to figure this out. I'm just hoping that I can ask some okay questions to get us along the way. But I think that gives you a lot more room inside the space to kind of explore.
I like that. Well, and I think also if you recognize like this like, fellow traveler perspective, you can recognize like places yourself where you've had your own epiphanies and these own moments where you've learned things, and recognize that you and I are not static, we're dynamic. And so if I view you as like having like a bad thought and I have the good thought, it's not, it's all flow, right? There's a lot of people whose thinking evolves over time. And if I can recognize that I've evolved and you're evolved, we're evolving together, and we don't need to rush or force anything. My job is to be a good human. And as Bill and Ted say, be excellent to each other.
I love it. This is my line, right? When I always say, I'm just here to be a good human. I'm just trying to be a good human. And, I'd like to hang out with other people who are trying to solve the same problem. Solve for connection, try to be a good human. That's the be excellent to each other. Someone asks inside the chat, apparently they can't get enough of Scott Waltman. They want to know if you've got public speaking engagements, other places we can lurk. I know we gave links, but there are other things out there that where you're talking, or otherwise we might find you in a podcast or a public event.
Yeah. I should probably do a better job of compiling those, right? I recently did an episode of the Everyday Stoic podcast, which was fun. I enjoyed that. You'd have to Google it. I don't think I even have it linked anywhere. If you Google, I think my name and everyday Stoic, it should come up. On my Instagram page under my reels, there's a live that we recorded on CBT Day, International CBT Day, where I talk about with the president of the Turkish CBT Association about modern CBT. What does that look like? What else? I'm doing a lot of upcoming therapy related talks. I should do more not therapy related things, but yeah.
You mean in a professional space, right?
Unless Holly's asking these questions to avoid me, because there's an unclear valence to the question, right? She's not saying where are these? How do I get to them? She's just saying
where are you going to be so I can be somewhere else?
I just want to know. Scott's got two things, and you already said both of them, so I don't know that I want to incorporate anymore, which is fine.
Awesome. Listen, I was just about to close this door, but I see Holly now has her hand up. So I'm just going to go ahead and let her ask whatever it is she's on her mind, and then we'll go up. We'll be done here. But I'm going to add Holly to the spotlight since she asked this question. So, basically, you're going to have to tell us, are you trying to avoid Scott or get more of Scott?
Well, the whole avoiding, I really hadn't thought about that until you brought it up. But, I have, when this presentation came up, I kind of looked a little bit at your background and stuff, and I just really enjoyed a lot of the things that you have. I love your memes, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
My teenagers and I really connect on those, so thank you. But I'm actually doing a master's program right now in rehabilitation counseling.
Oh, cool. That's exciting.
And so I'm learning so much more about myself in this process. And so, all of any other speaking engagements, just really identify with a lot that you say and the direction that you go.
Oh, so there's a talk on YouTube also from the New York City CBT Association. I did a talk on Socratic Questioning for them, although it's an abbreviated recording because I had them not put the role plays up because I feel like that's it's hard to get somebody to do a good role play with you if they're going to be if they're being recorded. And then conferences I usually go to or I usually speak. Typically, I never miss the ABCT, which is in Philly this year. So Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. I probably have to do some more. I probably have to do some more submissions because I have the book coming out. That's usually how it goes, but. Yeah. And there's also an episode of the Sanity podcast I did too. But I think, if you were trying to pick just one, I would go for the most recent one with the Everyday Stoic. Is probably gonna be the most fun.
I was going to say there's a thing out there somewhere. I think the thing that we did with Donald is probably out there.
Somewhere. I did Plato Academy.
How to think like Socrates.
How to think like Socrates, and I also did one where they did on death and dying, where I talked about Socrates before his own death. That was a lot of fun. They let me do that. I was like, this is exciting.
Very good. All right, friends. Thank you all for being here. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here because I'm going to end this call in just a minute or two. But one last time, thank you, Scott Waltman. This has been a treat. I knew this was going to be fun when I said, I need to reach out to Scott. And then we did this thing, and I'm all over it. So
I had so much fun.
Yeah, thank you.